Western Mass, and I am a member of Massachusetts Peace Action and its campaign called Ukraine, A Time for Peace. This webinar is entitled, by the way, MAPPA offers webinars on the Ukraine war almost once a month and has been doing so for a year. So we're really happy to have this one tonight titled Ending the Tragedy of the Ukraine War, Compromise or Collapse, with Professor Nicolai Petro. And I want to welcome him after a fair amount of emailing in the last few weeks to set this up. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
And welcome everybody again. Here's some information about Professor Petro. Nicolai N. Petro, Professor of Political Science at University of Rhode Island and Senior Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. He's the author of The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. Came out in 2023. He served as an advisor and professor in Russia from 1989 to 1990 and 1996 to 1997, and in Ukraine from 2013 to 2014. And he has visited Ukraine yearly from 2010 through 2021. He will discuss his deep knowledge of and experience in Ukraine over the past 11 years, focusing on the deep divisions between Eastern and Western Ukrainians. These divisions culminated in an armed insurgency in the Donbass region against the central government in Kiev, which was increasingly seen as restricting and threatening their linguistic, religious, political, cultural, and economic rights. He asserts that the war can be ended and a lasting peace achieved if these divisions are understood, respected, and resolved through a process of conflict resolution similar to that used by the ancient Greeks to reconcile some of their bitter differences that led to war. Welcome again, everybody. Welcome, Professor Petro. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who are watching this today. I'm especially glad to be able to talk about my book, and we'll be happy to answer questions on any topic that you might want to know about, and that I'll do my best to answer. So my book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, looks at the conflict in Ukraine through the lens of classical Greek tragedy. The connection between Kiev and Athens is probably not obvious, so let me illustrate it by referencing the tragedy that Thucydides wrote, namely the history of the Peloponnesian War. That war, as Professor Richard Ned Lebeau notes, quote, was the result of an improbable series of remarkably bad judgments made by the leaders of the several powers involved, end quote. Pericles' bad judgment derived from the unraveling of traditional social constraints and respect for institutions. This led to the loss of the ability to understand each other. Even friends and neighbors were thus transformed into incomprehensible barbarians who, as we might say today, live in an alternate universe. Thucydides wrote the Peloponnesian War precisely, as he put it, to restore the grammar of politics and to enable the healing of societies in conflict. The performance of tragic plays during the annual civic festival of the Dionysia played a crucial part in that healing. The anguish evoked by the plays inspired catharsis, a purging of the soul that restored healthy balance by removing toxic emotions and ambitions. Only through catharsis, Aristotle argued, could society free itself from the cycle of tragedy in which every offense given in the name of justice begets another in the name of vengeance. Greek tragedies often dwell on the fact that men confuse vengeance with justice, but are later forced to realize that they are opposites. In the Oresteia trilogy, Aeschylus has the goddess of wisdom, Athena, ask the audience directly, do you want to be judges or do you want justice? The crucial distinction being that true justice strives not for retribution and dominance, but rather for harmony and balance. Thus, if the declarations of Western and Ukrainian leaders that they will stop at nothing to punish Russia are to be believed, then they have forsaken what the Greeks would call true justice, which is a solution to strife that is seen as just by all. Instead, they have embraced the mindset that the Greeks called nemesis, which in all Greek tragedies invariably provokes the wrath of the gods. After living in Ukraine for 2 whole years and visiting for more than a decade, the misunderstandings between Athens and Sparta struck me as remarkably similar to those that have developed within Ukraine. Both can be seen as part of a recurring cycle of tragedy that derives from long-standing historical and cultural narratives about each other. The 2014 Maidan, which led to the marginalization of Russophone Ukrainians in all aspects of national life, greatly intensified the political conflict between Eastern and Western Ukraine. But this was merely the latest in a series of mutual recriminations. Perhaps some form of federalism, as proposed by the former leader of the political opposition in Ukraine, the Ruch, Vyacheslav Chornovil, in the late 1990s, might have made Ukrainian national unity easier to achieve. Ultimately, however, it is undeniable that the loss of Crimea and Donbass, even though assisted by the Russian military, owed much to the previous 3 decades of nationalist policies that had alienated the local population. The ensuing rebellion there led to an 8-year bloody stalemate, which Russia decided to end in February 2022 by invading Ukraine. I should mention that I see no justification for Russia's invasion, even if it was provoked. I do not accept the view popularized by Karl von Clausewitz that war can be justified as a continuation of politics by other means. Since I consider war itself to be a sin, there is no amount of provocation that can serve to justify it for me. At the same time, however, it is foolish not to acknowledge the ambitions that led to this local conflict assuming global proportions, namely, U.S. efforts to contain Russia's role in global affairs and Russia's efforts to end America's global hegemony. It should therefore come as no surprise that in the midst of this raging great power conflict, Ukraine itself, just like the besieged island of Melos, described so poignantly by Thucydides, suffers what it must, while the strong do what they will. Of course, there are always those who welcome war. For Ukraine, because it would, quote, arouse the militaristic spirit of the nation, end quote, and would have what former Interior Minister Arsen Avakov called a salutary and cleansing effect on the nation. For Russia, because according to senior analyst Sergei Karaganov, it would provide a clean break with the corrupt West and open up new vistas for a truly autochthonous Russian civilization. And for the West, because the Cold War did not end as it should have, with the Russians acknowledging their defeat. They must therefore be decisively defeated and humiliated now. Most politicians do not want war, but they all want the fruits of war and can therefore easily convince themselves that coexistence with an enemy whose values differ from our own is simply unbearable. After all, as Thucydides points out, what values could democratic Athenians possibly share with authoritarian Spartans who lived nearly 200 miles away? By Pericles' time, this values gap had become what we would today call a civilizational choice for a rules-based order. In this respect, Washington and Moscow have learned nothing from the history of Athens and Sparta. Now, supporters of the current war might rebut. We all know that the US and NATO have made their share of mistakes. But we must now deal with Russian aggression, not how we got here. I submit, however, that ignoring the underlying pathologies within Ukraine will misdiagnose the problem and offer remedies that will only make matters worse. Russia is the aggressor. That is a fact, but it is not the only relevant fact. It lies atop pathologies that have been festering for decades. There are three pathologies that I would draw special attention to. One is our unwillingness in the West to view post-communist Russia as part of the West. Decades of Cold War political antagonism and cultural ostracism of Russia have produced so much fear of change that when the opportunity suddenly arose to heal and reunite the continent in the 1990s, Western leaders failed to take the one step that would have anchored Russia in Europe and Europe in Russia. I am referring, of course, to replacing NATO, an alliance designed to keep Russia out of European affairs, with a truly pan-European security arrangement that would have merged the interests of Eastern and Western Europe. It is worth recalling that after the Second World War, the father of the EU, Jean Monnet, insisted that Germany be integrated into European institutions as quickly as possible for precisely this reason. The key to peace, Monnet insisted, was not forming coalitions of nations, but changing people's psychology from fear to trust. The most fateful error that Western leaders made after the collapse of communism was to do exactly the opposite with respect to Russia. This is relevant today because any durable peace in Ukraine will have to embrace Russia's role as a core European power. Moreover, security concerns here are not even the most important ones. Far more important is that they be reinforced by economic, cultural, and political integration of an unprecedented scope. If there is to be any hope of finally bringing to an end the Cold War that still rages in our minds. A second pathology is the mutual lack of comprehension that has emerged between elites in Ukraine and Russia. In the West, this is usually attributed to Putin's ostensible refusal to recognize the existence of Ukraine. But the reality is far more complex and predates this war by many generations. It is true that many Russians see Ukrainians as so much like themselves that they may as well be one people. The effort of Ukrainian elites to accentuate these differences therefore strikes them as contrived, particularly when these same Ukrainian elites tend to speak Russian amongst themselves. As a result, they often attribute this insistence on Ukrainian distinctiveness to a venal desire of elites in Kiev for wealth and power. But while there was certainly an element of greed in the promotion of Ukrainian nationalism, something that former Ukrainian presidents Kravchuk and Kuchma have never denied, the persistence of a Ukrainian national consciousness and its gradual expansion from the realms of folklore, song, and literature into the arena of politics has been gaining strength throughout the 20th century. Significantly, it has always reemerged whenever there was a crisis of state authority, whether it be under Austro-Hungarian, Polish, Soviet, or even post-Soviet rule. The main difference in the 21st century is that these crises of state authority have become more frequent. This is relevant today because to end the cycle of violence, Russian elites and Ukrainian elites will have to reach a new level of political maturity when talking to each other. Russians will have to learn to appreciate Ukraine's desire for both cultural and political independence, while Ukrainians must recognize that their cultural and political independence will have to rest on more than just being anti-Russian. Both will have to learn to appreciate their common heritage as a source of strength, rather than as a cause for vendetta. Simply put, when Ukrainians and Russians learn to separate their political differences from their cultural differences, their security interests will no longer be battles for national survival. The third pathology is what I call the struggle over who gets to define Ukrainian identity, which is rooted in the divergent historical memories of Eastern and Western Ukraine. Excuse me. What probably would have led to two Ukrainian states, Galicia and Malorossia, had it occurred after World War I, as was proposed at the peace conference in Versailles, has now turned into an anti-colonial struggle to cleanse Eastern and Southern Ukraine of its ostensibly unnatural identity. This imperative of forging a monocultural and monoethnic Ukraine has been a constant in Ukrainian nationalist writing since the 1930s and was embraced with new vigor after the 2014 Maidan. This is relevant today because this 1930s way of forging Ukrainian unity is proving to be a very painful and costly way of dealing with the country's multiculturalism. Not only does it require permanent restrictions on the civil, political, and cultural rights of millions of fellow Ukrainian citizens, foreshadowed in the suppression in early 2021 of opposition media, then in 2022, the suppression of opposition political parties, and in 2023, the suppression of the nonconformist Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But given Russia's proximity, it will almost certainly backfire. Consider, for example, what has happened since the state encouraged people to snitch on their neighbors for the crime of publicly speaking Russian. After a patriotic shift to Ukrainian in late 2022, in 2024, the Ukrainian language usage in schools, at home, and on the internet actually fell by double digits. Thanks to such policies, surveys show that language usage now rivals corruption as the top issue causing social division. The obvious alternative to eradicating a minority is to offer it protection in exchange for its political loyalty. Alas, this solution has been rejected time and again by Ukrainian nationalists who seem to agree with Russian President Vladimir Putin that if Ukrainians are allowed to freely choose their own language, religion, and cultural identity, many would wind up feeling that they are as much Russian as Ukrainian. I have always believed, however, that the fear of disloyalty voiced by many Ukrainian politicians is unjustified. And I submit as evidence the large number of Russophone Ukrainians willing to fight for Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Now, if I'm right that the current conflict in Ukraine is best understood as a series of interlocking international, bilateral, and internal conflicts, what is the solution? I will get to that in a second. But the tragic nature of politics does, I think, indicate two outcomes that would definitely not resolve it. The first is the total defeat of Russia, as currently demanded by the West and Ukraine. This would create a plethora of new hotspots in Eurasia, where the United States, India, China, Iran, and Turkey would aggressively vie over the spoils of a diminished Russia. For Europe, this would create an almost irresistible temptation to take advantage of Russia's temporary weakness to expand Ukrainian territory at Russia's expense, say as an act of compensation. This would ensure generations of future conflict. China does not want this. None of the other regional actors want this, and I suggest that America and Europe would be wise not to want this either. Within Ukraine itself, Russia's defeat would leave millions of citizens who, as former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko has often reminded us, consider Ukraine to be an alien territory and culture. This population would be a perennial obstacle to Ukrainianization and Europeanization. The alternative currently foreseen by Ukrainian law of deporting millions of millions of Ukrainians to Russia might solve the cultural problem for now, but at the cost of severely depopulating eastern and southern Ukraine, with devastating economic consequences for the country. A second equally undesirable outcome is a total Russian victory, if it were accompanied by the collapse of central authority in Kiev. I suspect that Russia's military strategy, so unlike the, quote, shock and awe pursued by the American military in Iraq, and accompanied by Ukrainian President Zelensky going on world tours and hosting foreign leaders in Kiev, was chosen precisely to avoid such a collapse. The problem with the Russian victory is that it would encourage several of Ukraine's Western neighbors to annex what they consider to be their historical territories, and thus create a perennial Syria-like situation on Russia's western border. The only solution that is compatible with the lessons of tragedy is therefore a negotiated settlement. This option has thus far been opposed by the West, which sabotaged the accord reached between Ukraine and Russia in March 2022 in Istanbul, precisely because the terms were seen as too favorable to Russia. Still, the solution that presents itself today is as obvious as it was then. It is the classic formula of land for peace. Specifically, Donbass, Crimea, and the regions creating a land bridge to Crimea would be given to Russia in exchange for a peace treaty that would allow the rest of Ukraine to pursue EU membership enshrine its complete separation from Russia, and afford it, quote, Israel-like, end quote, security guarantees, but not membership in NATO. This would preserve roughly 80% of Ukraine and strengthen it by giving up those regions that have historically been the most pro-Russian. It may not be popular to say so today, but this solution has been suggested by several Ukrainian political and cultural figures, including writers Vasil Shklyar, Yuri Andryukhovich, and former presidents Leonid Kravchuk and Viktor Yushchenko, who routinely referred to Crimea and Donbass as a threat to a truly Ukrainian Ukraine. Even President Zelensky's former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, whose popular blog is seen as a bellwether of Ukrainian elite thinking, has voiced his support. Quote, "We get to keep 80% of our territory, end the war, and enter NATO. This would be the FRG-GDR option. The Federal Republic of Germany enters the NATO alliance, but the German Democratic Republic is deemed German territory, which will absolutely return, but to which NATO guarantees do not extend. This is not at all a bad deal," end quote. But by far the greatest obstacle to a peaceful settlement, in my view, is that it would conclusively demonstrate NATO's irrelevance and make a new European security arrangement that includes Russia inevitable. American politicians see saving Ukraine on these terms as a defeat and are willing to do, as President Biden has often said, whatever it takes to pursue victory over Russia. Tragedy, however, reminds us that the pursuit of total victory never leads to durable peace. It only sows the seeds of future conflict. The real solution, as I have suggested, is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Ukraine. Such commissions have promoted reconciliation in over 45 countries during the last 50 years. Among the many models I've looked at, I have explored 3 in detail: South Africa, Guatemala, and Spain, which all have something to offer Ukraine. In South Africa, after the end of apartheid, the Anglican Church, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, transformed a situation fraught with the potential for violence into one of forgiveness and healing. In Guatemala, the commission fostered a national discussion of the country's history of genocide against the local Indian population, despite the military government's reluctance to do so. And in Spain, the pact among the country's political parties to literally forget the past, el pacto de olvido, gave new democratic institutions time to emerge and re-examine the country's past in a new and constructive social context. Though their mechanisms differ, each commission replicates the social therapy of the Athenian Dionysia by putting on public display the testimony of all sides. This leads the public to catharsis, a purging of mutual hatred that allows for social healing by restoring the humanity of the enemy. Since my book places such a large emphasis on healing the internal divisions of Ukraine, I thought I would end with a reflection on what I might have written differently today. The vehemence of the Western response to Russian aggression certainly took me by surprise and leads me to conclude that the tragedies of Europe, Russia, and Ukraine are intertwined. Restoring social harmony within Ukraine alone will therefore no longer be enough. It must be accompanied by efforts to restore harmony between Ukraine and Russia and with all of Europe. I have suggested something along the lines of a new Treaty of Westphalia, which rewrote the rules of international conduct and brought an end to the bloody 30 Years' War. But there is an even closer historical analogy, the Helsinki Accords of 1975, which set up the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Helsinki Accords addressed several key issues that were left unresolved after the end of the Second World War. Today, we need a similar willingness to address the issues left unresolved after the end of the Cold War. I made a similar plea in November 2008 at a gathering of senior political figures in Kiev, chaired by former President of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. Afterwards, he came up to me, shook my hand, and said, "You're right, of course, but it's too late now. For the sake of Ukraine and humanity, I hope he is wrong." Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Petro. Paul, did we agree we're going to hold off on the action steps till later, or are we doing that now?
Yeah, I think Dr. Petro would like to go right into the questions.
Right. I'm going to ask for your help, Cole. Also, I'm not so great at seeing a lot of yellow hands, so maybe you could call out. I don't have those. And I want to urge people I want to suggest about a 45-second limit on the questions or comments that each person gives. That will enable that many more people, and there's a lot of us here, to be able to ask a question rather than somebody goes for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So when 45 seconds is up, I will let you know. If you would call on the first one.
It's Yuri Smatter.
Can I go now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Petro. That was a great presentation, and thank you to the Massachusetts peace organizers for organizing this. My question would be, two very quick questions. But my first question would be: is it possible to reconcile the two Ukrainian identities? Ukrainians that speak the Ukrainian language and preach to the Ukrainian church, and those Ukrainians who do speak Ukrainian very
I'm not
much but do speak Russian and do very given all that's taken place.
So the question is, can they be reconciled? Yes. I mean, in theory, there's no reason why they shouldn't. Belgium exists. Switzerland exists. Ukraine existed as a unified.
But Belgium is a very unhappy marriage, though.
No, they're not. The question is,
I live in Belgium. It's a very unhappy marriage.
Be that as it may, I'm lowering the bar, not to happiness, but to the simple coexistence. Let's put it this way: coexistence. The question of having the ability to coexist with someone you dislike is a big step. It's a huge positive step in relations. Once that has been established, one can debate with the other side, not as a horrible, inhuman entity, but rather as someone where we can negotiate the pros and cons and maybe provide an exchange of benefits. As again exists in sort of the examples I cited are just some of them. But of course, we also have other areas like the border regions in Italy and Austria, where there are minorities on both sides that speak the minority language, but locally they are the preponderance. And again, there have been ways in which the needs of the local population has been recognized, and that, at least for now, suffices. Although I was watching the Italian news yesterday, and there was a really ugly incident with a bunch of German-speaking youths in a school kicking an Italian-speaking one of their Italian-speaking classmates. But those are really, I think, now exceptional. And of course, there was an example in the 1960s, 1970s of terrorist groups fighting for the Südtirol independence. But, now they have their own political party, their own faction in the Italian parliament called the Südtiroler Volkspartei. And they manage to coexist and interact. So I think it is not beyond the realm of possibility, particularly since we have the example of the 30 years of relatively peaceful coexistence, which could have been, I would argue, dealt with better to avoid these sorts of conflicts from exploding in the future. But there's always the possibility of mutual accommodation if one is willing to forgive and forget. I was struck in my reading of the Greek classics that I think it was Euripides's proposal for what he ascribes it to Zeus's formula for overcoming conflict, he says, is forgetfulness. It's studied forgetfulness, so that one doesn't carry the anger and the burden, most importantly, not only in yourself, but as a legacy for the next generation.
Thank you for that first question and your response, Professor. Let's move on to a second question. I see some hands. Jeffrey Barkdale.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I really loved what you just said, and I know I got a lot of questions, but I put them in the chat box for you, Nicolai. But one thing I'm sure of, one thing you said, it's something about coexisting with authoritarians, something about that. I believe that George Lucas may have had the answer when he in the Star Wars franchise through the Pelion-Gabberson treaty, because I did my own research too about this. You'd be surprised. So if you like, we can communicate with each other, so we can talk more about stuff like this, about what you're presenting and all this stuff, so we can probably even find a solution to ending this war, because that's what I'm also working on too. What do you say?
Very good. There, in fact, is nothing new that needs to be discovered for a conclusion to this conference, to this conflict. I'm sorry. What needs to be done is to be serious about about undertaking negotiations. And we have in the past, with the U.S. administration, had an attitude that rejected the possibility of a compromise foisted upon Ukraine by the force of arms from Russia. And right now, as I read Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio's description of what he thinks U.S. policy should be, he said, we should make the pursuit of peace in this conflict our priority. That was never the case before. because the priority was, as Secretary of Defense Austin put it, the strategic defeat of Russia. So we will see what comes of this shift, if it's meaningful, if it actually is carried out in some sort of fashion. But I would say that there are almost an innumerable number of historical treaties that could be used as, or parts of which could be used as models for resolving this conflict. There's really nothing new or particularly unusual about this conflict in European history.
Thank you for the question and that response. Before we go on, I just want to remind everybody this is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out, I believe, tomorrow to everyone who registered. So if you think this is as valuable as I do and want to pass it on to anybody else who couldn't be here, please do that or watch it again. Let's go on to Norma Harrison. Yes, please. I think you're still on mute. Say something.
Yes.
Okay, you got in the way. It says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves, so get out of my way.
You're
We did.
unmuted.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, it's certainly very carefully done and studied. My concern is that the past 100 years have been an attack against the communist, the Russian Revolution. Our owners are scared to death that it is being received with and advanced throughout the world, and that this is the undergirding of things like, well, even Ukraine, which has these conflicts that you well described. Ukraine was backed up by the United States. The United States doesn't have an economy, it has war, and that's how it buys and profits our owners. And it looks for NATO to be supported as the control device about the attempt to create a preponderance of US-style domination.
Norma, thank you. Your 45 seconds is up. Do you have a question?
Thank you.
No questions, just wanted to make those comments?
Well, and I would like everybody to go, yes, you're right.
I can tell you after 40 years of teaching that almost never happens in my classes. No, I think you make a good point, particularly during the initial phases of the establishment of the Soviet Union and the growth of the Communist International. But Russia has not been a communist state since 1991. So it's been nearly, more than a generation now. And it's high time to recognize this. And certainly in the 1990s, early 2000s, the ambition of Russian leaders, first Yeltsin, then Putin, was to join the West as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, because they felt Russia could compete very well with Western industries and the Western economic model. So they wanted to be given the chance to do so. But for reasons that are still very hotly debated in the West, they were not allowed to do so. And today, as opposed to the era of containment after World War II, the effort is not only to diminish and contain communism, but also to diminish and contain the entire Russian nation and all of its people, its values, its religions, etc. And that makes the current attitude of the current policies really something very different from what containment was. Because containment, at least as George F. Kennan envisioned it, was actually a way of offering an olive branch to the Russian people who were were envisioned as our natural allies against the dictatorial regime. Right now, we are basically writing the entire country off. And as far as I can tell, not just for one generation. And I just can't imagine that turning out very well for anybody.
Thank you. Norma, I do see your hand waving, and I know you're eager, but I would like to move on to another person now. You've had a good turn. Thank you. Let's move on to Terry Burns said, if I pronounce it right.
Yes, that's quite right. I wanted to ask G.W.F. Hegel in his lectures on aesthetics, and I must thank my fellow attendee Harris Grumman for having once assigned me the relevant essay in his class, argues that in order to have tragedy, and he uses Sophocles' Antigone as his example, both sides must be right. He argues that Creon and Antigone are both right, and that's why it's tragic.
That's right.
In a great many conflicts that I've seen, I must say South Africa, Guatemala, Spain, and Palestine being exceptions to this, very frequently that I find conflicts where both sides are wrong. Does Hegel's formula still apply? And my question is, does Hegel's observation fit into your own melding of the artistic form of tragedy with tragedy in the sense of human suffering in real life that you've been talking about?
Well, as I understand that essay, Hegel is taking not the position that there is a right, a truth on both sides, but that both sides define the truth for themselves. And as a result, that makes the conflict a tragic one because there is no possible resolution that can satisfy both. So that remains the problem that we face in the majority of conflicts until our political leaders can realize that, or come to the realization that what they define as the absolute truth is not. It is merely their view of the truth, their particular interpretation of the correctness of what should be done. And when that can be discussed and the correctness of the opposing side acknowledged as well, then we have the possibility of another very important component of the resolution of conflict, which is dialogue. Dialogue, as the word implies, demands that two voices be listened to. Not one voice telling the other voice what's right and what's wrong, but actually, literally, the two voices are on an equal footing and listening to each other. The conditions for that are very difficult to achieve. And, I'm under no illusions about how, about that being easy. But that is where raw power does certainly play a role in forcing both sides to the table, but at the point at which they are at the table and negotiating, the relative power disbalance, I think, plays an ever diminishing role as the importance of respect for dialogue and the ability to reach a consensus becomes more and more important.
Thank you.
That I think is what actually happens in successful negotiations. Even though in the midst of war, no, we can't negotiate. Never negotiate with terrorists. Don't do this. Never, never, never. But in fact, it always happens.
What a radical concept, dialogue. Let's move on to Valentine, if I pronounced it right, Mogadam, please.
Yes, thank you very much. What a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate that. I really hope that you're right about the prospects for a negotiated settlement and truth and reconciliation. That would be the best outcome possible. But I have two questions about that. One has to do with the possibility of a generational divide within Ukraine itself. I was speaking with a young woman who actually defended the erection of that statue to Stefan Bandera. That World War II era Ukrainian fascist and anti-Semite. And she defended him as a Ukrainian nationalist, which I found quite shocking. So it's possible that the older Ukrainians, remembering the ties with Russia, et cetera, might be more inclined towards a negotiated settlement and dialogue and so on, but perhaps the younger ones are not. I may be wrong about this. This is an N of one that I am mentioning, but I wonder what your views on that is. And may I also just ask the following? You have used the term Russian aggression, and my own sense is that Russia was actually provoked, and there was a trap that was created for Russia by the West and NATO, and that the Russians fell into it, similar to what happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. I mean, when they went in initially, when the Red Army went in initially, the idea was that they would be out by the Persian New Year.
Thank you, Valentine.
But then Reagan said,
I'm going to ask you to leave it at that, and let's hear Professor's response. Thanks.
Thank you.
I guess I would say that I find both of your arguments very plausible. Which is why I added the caveat about why what war is for me. War is, as I see it, is first and foremost a sin. It is a missing of the mark. And if you fall into a sin, you should not be condemned for it, but you bear a responsibility nevertheless. You shouldn't have fallen into that trap. You should have prepared yourself better, etc. Now we're veering away from the moral criteria into the practical politics, but I don't want to offer any justification for violence because we don't know whether a different outcome could have been accomplished. But we know, what we do know, what we can say, because it's part of the historical record, is that, and we have the transcript of the national security meeting that Putin presided over when he asked for all the members of the security staff to vote on whether to intervene. And Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, argued that not all the opportunities for diplomacy had yet been abandoned. Now, he sounds today like he no longer thinks that, given how things have evolved. But that was his view at the time. So I'd rather not second guess what might have been, but just stress that I don't see, I have no I have no truck with just war. I don't believe in a just war theory. I don't believe there was ever a just war. And all the righteous wars I see as unrighteous. That's just my own position on that. The other issue is the generational divide. Possibly. But as much as that is logical to assume, it is also a function of ignorance. In other words, young people do not know their history. Their history goes back a very limited time. And if they, I've actually witnessed some of these discussions in our church in Odessa. They don't see eye to eye, and when they talk about it, they talk about different realities, different historical contexts. But they're both Ukrainians. So that's the thing at the end of the day that I would stress is the ability not only of different Ukrainians of different histories and different languages and different religions, but also of different generations, obviously. They need to be able to talk to each other and learn how to talk to each other. And that's not going to be easy. But for every moment that sort of people say, well, look, the young people think this way and the older people think that way, then I come across the statistic that I mentioned of language usage. And it should not really be that surprising to learn that there was an emotional yearning for Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language uses as a way of affirming that identity in 2022, early 2023. And then when things kind of dragged out and were not going so well, people reverted, even young people in school reverted to their previous behavior. And the reason for that, which I say is not at all surprising, is because what is the greatest influence on Ukraine's entertainment sphere and cultural sphere and songs, pop culture and movies and things like that? Russia, it's always Russia, because Russian is accessible. And not just for the older generation who remember this movie or that popular movie actor. They have been replaced among young people with the most popular singers, modern singers, many of whom are Russian. It goes up and down. I'm not saying it's all one or another, but Russia culturally produces so much more than Ukraine does, and generally people admit of a much higher quality than Ukraine has in the past. That if you're a young people and just want a cool song, a cool artist, and just want to have fun, you're going to not care terribly over the long term, whether it's a Russian singer, a Ukrainian singer, a German singer, or something else. The beat has to be good, and that will take priority, it seems to me.
Thank you. I think Francisco Manuel had your hand up a long time, and now I see you. And then we'll go to Harris Groman. Go ahead, Francisco.
So I hope I have, yes, I'm talking. So thank you so much. It was Francisco Puglianzo. It was an amazing presentation till now. Thank you so much on all the answers. So from the sociological point of view, I would say that identity politics, especially when it's too much force, it doesn't really stick for long. And what the professor was just saying, it pretty much goes in that way. And I'm living in Germany mostly. I noticed, and dealing with a lot of Russian and Ukrainian people, I noticed that on the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians would react and say, I don't speak Russian, I speak Ukrainian. And nowadays everybody speaks Russian and everybody deals with each other as like they were best friends, and there is no more that divide, which is like someone else was writing, there is a lot of hope. Yes, of course, because these two people, depending where exactly you are geographically, they have very a lot of affinities. But what I understand, and it preoccupies me most and foremost, is the Europeans. The Europeans do have been constructing this divide with their democracy and anti-Russia, like it's an antagonism to Russia. And I noticed that the hate on the population is much more deep in most European societies, especially as much as you go to Eastern Europe. And in taking that into consideration, it is very interesting how the Americans are understanding the dangers that this war is going to escalate, but we see the Europeans exactly on the opposite, trying to escalate more. And especially these countries in the Baltic, they have some historical antagonism with Russia, Finland, the Baltic countries, Poland. They are reacting over
Francisco, that is
excessively.
45 seconds. Do you want to take it right to a question?
Yes. My question is, if you see it's possible to actually bring the Europeans to realize the danger they are creating, and especially which dangers you see the Baltic countries and Finland trying to impose a sea blockage in the Baltic Sea against Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg.
My sense is that European attitudes of the people are more diverse than those of the current political leadership. So this, to me, is illustrated by, I wouldn't call it pro-Russian sentiment, but certainly a more nuanced attitude toward Russia among the AfD and Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, the opposition parties. There's also the right in France. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni heads a coalition where many of her closest allies are much more sympathetic to Russia and wanting to distance themselves from American policy, especially on defense, than she is. And so, and in Eastern Europe, we have small parties in Poland, certainly not electorally competitive, but nevertheless, they do exist, which point to historical ties and the need to establish a security framework that includes Russia. And of course, we have the latest results in Romania, the Romanian elections, which who knows how that will end up, but where the candidate with greater sympathies for Russia or antipathies for Ukraine seem to be leading, and in Bulgaria as well. Not to mention Hungary, not to mention Slovakia, which are well known in this example. So I think there is more diversity than we realize, but the political impact has not yet been manifested. And I expect to see future governments in Europe, as the economic, political, and security crisis in Europe, in the EU, deepens, and resistance to 5% GDP spending on defense as a new NATO norm. That's never been the case, and I just, if NATO somehow manages to impose that, it's not a NATO that anyone that has ever been in our experience. You know, a war mindset, as the current General Secretary puts it. But I expect there to be a backlash because precisely against this, precisely because European public opinion is more divided than the political elite's opinion in Europe today.
Thank you. Now let's go to Harris Grumman.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this presentation. It's really quite impressive and stimulating, extremely stimulating. I would have to say right off the bat, I mean, politically, I couldn't agree with you more about almost everything you said. But I do want to get to something that's a little more, I want to get your sort of reaction to some thoughts you put in my mind, partly inspired by that earlier questioner, Terry Burnstead, who blamed me for stuffing his head with Hegel. But he is, on his side, he's a very good actor on this live stage. So he has a very sensitive understanding of what you're talking about when you talk about tragedy. I guess what I was interested in is, you put Thucydides on the level of tragedy,
Yes.
which is a stimulating idea, but it has the problem that Terry raised, and somebody else might have in the chat, that, implying that, yeah, both sides are right, because at the level of the tragedy, I mean, as an art product, yes, I mean, it's an allegory in which both sides are right. Whereas in Thucydides or in World War II or, Guatemala or wherever you want to go, like Terry said, sometimes one side is right and the other is wrong. That doesn't mean they shouldn't negotiate. So, like, it seems to me that what we desperately need in in Ukraine and Russia is a negotiation. And a negotiation, people don't have to agree that each other are right. I mean, they don't have to have truth and reconciliation. I mean, I'm a union organizer, and the boss is wrong. That's
45 seconds.
Okay. So I guess my question is, art is like a longer term project to try to get people to recognize their common humanity, but I don't think it can really bridge the gap now. And so you're right to put it out there intellectually, but I don't know if it's the right guidepost for getting to negotiations.
My discussion in the first chapter of my book, where I talk about the role of Greek tragedy in Greek political society, did not discuss it as an art form. It was simply not that for the Greek. It was, unless you elide any distinction between art and politics, which is another possibility. But what I was most intrigued by was the role, the social, the role of tragedy in building emotional empathy as a means for the leaders of Athens to reach the stage of negotiations. It was a calculated policy, and the Dionysia was a civic exercise, which was very routinized, very ritualized, and occurred twice yearly, precisely to bring people together to discuss these and other controversial topics, sometimes murder, sometimes the obligation to the state, or when those obligations should give way to the personal honor of the individual, all sorts of issues. But the war with Sparta was a recurring theme. And so I hone in on the importance of the civic aspect of tragedy to the efforts to bring that conflict to an end. I don't go into success or failure because tragedy didn't exist as a civic function very long, only a century. And then when Athens became an empire, when Athens expanded and became an empire, it fell by the wayside. It simply became no longer interesting to Greek leaders to involve the populace with this level of intensity in public discourse. Maybe there are some echoes in what we see today here in the United States and modern democracies. But so I think that's the key point there for me. And I do not pretend that we have anything like a Dionysia today. We don't. We don't live in communities of 20,000 people so that we can all fit into a stadium, and we do not all participate in direct democracy. well, that's no longer feasible given the political and economic and social systems that we have. But there are some intriguing mechanisms that I came across that I think have been moderately successful, not always successful, but have the possibility, when they've succeeded, they have done so by copying the function and aspirations of classical Greek tragedy, namely these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, specifically as a forum where all get to speak. They all get to speak. The record is there so that this generation, future generations can go back and make sense of what happened for themselves. That record has to be reconstituted or has to be created. And it is one of the great, not to overuse the word, but one of the great tragedies in Ukraine. There have been so many conflicts that have been swept under the rug. What actually happened in the 2014 Maidan in Kiev, who shot whom, at whose insistence. I was in Odessa during the trade union massacre where 50 people were burned alive. And that has never been investigated. It has never been investigated. There have been 7 government commissions, all of them shut down. That has to, I mean, I think eventually future generations will revisit this, but it's sad that it has to take so long.
Professor, before we go on to the next question or two, the last couple of questions, do you have a copy of your book Within Arm's Reach?
No, but I think I know it.
I know you know it. I was going to suggest you hold it up, and since you don't have one,
yeah.
I'm just
if you just type in, if you Google the tragedy of Ukraine, it probably still comes up as one of the first items. It's on Amazon, you know, and not hard to find generally. It's also on my website, which I would encourage people to visit because I post everything that I can, interviews, essays, anything like that, and a description of my book and interviews about my book as well. And that website is very simple. It's npetro.net.
And we could include the information about the book in the follow-up that's going to go out tomorrow or Saturday, John.
Great.
excellent. Thomas Daffern, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, okay. Greetings. Yes, Nicolai. Hello.
Hello.
Calling in from France here. It's in the middle of the night. But I want to jump straight to the solution and to applaud you for mentioning the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. I set one up for Britain and Ireland, and we had some success around the time of the Good Friday Agreement. And my question really is, how serious are you? Are you working with anyone to actually create one? How do you think we can do it? I mean, I'm willing to help and to work with you on this. I have some experience in the field. I think it's really urgent that we do this. And I'm speaking as coordinator of Philosophers for Peace in Europe, and I was actually elected in that post in Moscow in 1991 at a conference of Philosophers for Peace. And I've been carrying that, that responsibility. I think academics like you, like people on this call, I think we are the guys that should set this thing up. I don't think we can wait for Zelensky and Putin to do it, or Blinken. The politicians won't. I think intellectuals can play a role, and academics particularly, because we're supposed to believe in, the word is epoche in Greek. If we go to our classical sources, it's a suspension of judgment. Ukraine may be wrong, Russia may be wrong. Let's practice epoche. Let's bring them around a table. Let's hear each other's stories, and let's get some truth. So that's my question, really. How far along are you in that process, and do you?
Well, my contribution to date has been to point out the relevance of Truth and Reconciliation Commission's experience, which is vast, to this particular conflict. And not thanks to me, but at roughly the same time, one of Zelensky's closest friends from his entertainment days, a gentleman known as Sergei Sivocha, began the process of reaching out to British scholars about getting their input on their experience with Northern Ireland and other examples. Now, I wrote about this in my book and found it very promising. But Sergei Sivocha died last year of a heart attack, and I wrote a commemoration of him for I think it appeared in Responsible Statecraft. I call it the last Ukrainian peacemaker. And so unfortunately, he was a dynamo, a man with tremendous energy. But one of the things that dissipated his energy and probably led to an earlier death than might have been hoped for, is the fact that he was fighting so many Ukrainian nationalists who accused him of treason. And that's why it is no doubt valuable for anyone to look at this example and talk about it, and talk about the importance of not only the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but also the concept of neutrality as an alternative to armed conflict and military alliances. There's lots of good, valuable ideas. But the problem is when there is when the halls of power are shut to even the discussion of such ideas, it seems futile to many. One is writing, so to speak, not to have an impact, but to hopefully contribute to a discussion for a later time. And maybe that time, hopefully can come upon us sooner rather than later. But I know a lot of academics, former diplomats, who have been extremely disappointed, American diplomats, who've been extremely disappointed in the position taken by the Biden administration and its unwillingness to discuss alternatives to fighting. And we shall just have to see what happens next. So I don't disagree with you, but of course you will see you can only see the results when the people in positions of authority can embrace these ideas as well. And that's been the obstacle today.
I'll reach out to you, Nicolai. Thanks for your book.
Well, that last question and all of the questions and responses make me wish we had another hour and a half. This has been rich. This is good. But we're going to stop at 8:30 in 8 minutes. So one more question, briefly, 45 seconds. Professor, if you could respond just briefly, because we want to leave the last 4 or 5 minutes.
Try to do so.
Paul, our campaign coordinator, Paul, is going to offer some action steps, what people can do to help move this war away from escalation towards negotiation, towards peace. So the last question, Donald Smith.
Okay. Yes. So what? Okay. The question is, you said that there are diplomats. There are many diplomats who agree that the U.S. is. I'm interpreting it that the U.S. provoked the war. The U.S. isn't innocent. We need peace. Maybe that's not how you class it, but other than Chaz Freeman and Jack Matlock and a few people like Jeffrey Sachs and Noam Chomsky, almost all academics and diplomats refuse to oppose this war and to come out and say, hey, it's not Hitler isn't a pure Putin isn't a Hitler. It's much more nuanced than that. Why is there so much reluctance in Europe, especially where it's destroying their economies? Thank you for a minute.
Yeah. I think Chas Freeman and Jack Matlock are worth 10 of their opponents, but that's just my own assessment. Why is there such consensus? Well, first and foremost, because government and media, prestige, traditional media, set the intellectual parameters for discussion. And this has been happening for a long, long time. And it's not only Noam Chomsky that wrote about this, it's also W. Lance Bennett and other scholars of the media who spoke about this being the case during the Vietnam War. And of course, we can remember the outset of the Iraq War and how there was to be no discussion of questions about weapons of mass discussion and things like that. All of that fosters a set of a consensus about the kinds of issues that can be discussed and how they can be discussed. And when you look at the most influential newspapers, journals, and especially television, the kind of opinions there's not really in American media, and I would say also German, Italian, and French, which I can watch on the internet, not really much diversity of opinion that is raised, and that is a function of the type of media environment in which we live. But even this media environment, I remember a recent statement by, I believe it's Energy Secretary John Kerry, saying, it's awful that the government isn't automatically believed. And this is a threat to our democracy, that we have to justify ourselves. People don't automatically trust what it is they are being told by the government. And we have obviously a lot of debates in the media and internet over the role of the internet censorship, what kind is appropriate and how much of it should be. I have seen in my lifetime, and I was shocked recently to reflect on this, how it used to be that censorship was automatically condemned. But now it kind of depends, doesn't it? Depends whether you think of it as censorship or maybe misinformation. Maybe that should be censored, even though legally there is absolutely no basis for it in the American legal system. But somehow it has become acceptable to at least discuss the possibility of removing misinformation, malinformation, all sorts of information that basically boils down to opinions that the government does not want shared widely, and that's become more and more acceptable. So I think that I can only hope that that there's some serious pushback against
I'm surprised academics put up with it. Usually they're usually pretty,
No,
not afraid to.
my sense of academics is that they are creatures of habit, and that they like to be rewarded and seen as authoritative by their peers and their colleagues. And if you take an oddball position, that's not going to happen. And there will, now in my case, obviously tenured professors, that isn't a first concern. But you at least suspect that your grant applications will not be favorably reviewed, and you may not have access to certain pools of funds, and maybe your colleagues will begin to suspect that you're not in line with the consensus views of the administration. But I mean not only the national administration, but also the university administration. Even if that is not the case, the chilling effect of this kind of sense that I should be in the mainstream is very unfortunate. And I've always argued to my colleagues that we, as tenured professors, who we are not at all threatened by failure, by the loss of our jobs for academic reasons, for taking academically unpopular positions. We have a special obligation to say exactly what we mean and to say it as often and as widely as we can. But I'm not, and some people like me, some are, some aren't, not always offered the same venues that the supporters of the war are offered to express their views. That's just the way it is.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the questions, everybody. Let's give the last word to our campaign coordinator, Paul Shannon, how we can act to bring this war to a peaceful end.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Petro. Certainly raised some profound questions for us all to consider. We are at a critical point in the Ukraine war right now. On the one hand, there has been very serious escalations with long-range missiles involving U.S. military personnel being fired into Russia. Russia, of course, has stepped up missile attacks on energy infrastructure. A Russian general has been assassinated by intelligence people in Ukraine who are trained by us. Things can get out of hand very, very fast. On the other hand, we have a new administration coming in, and very confusing exactly what their position is going to be. But right now, this is the time for us to exert whatever influence we can. And so I'm just going to put up this, basically it's a petition. And if you agree with it, I'm asking you to go into the chat. I'm going to try to put the, let's see, how do I get back into that? I guess I'm going to have to stop screen sharing. Let me put the link to this petition in the chat. And what you can do is click on it, open it up, and you can fill it out right online. Just click the button. After you've filled it out, click the submit button at the end, and it'll go right to the senators, to your senators in the United States. I'm sorry, in Massachusetts. For those in other states, please send this message separately, directly to your senators rather than to ours. But for everyone in Massachusetts, if you could fill that out now, click it, fill it out, click the bottom to send, and those messages will go directly to those senators. Let me just mention also that we, as John mentioned earlier, we have a campaign for pushing for negotiations in Ukraine, and this is the time to do it. And so we're hoping that you may consider joining our campaign. I don't know whether I can get this up right now. We really need more and more people to, here it is. Let's see if I can get back now.
And you can always just go to the MAPA website.
You can go to the MAPA website. Here's the campaign that we're asking people to sign up for. Doesn't matter where you live for this. We just need to build consensus among people, whatever their specific political positions on the war, that this thing can get very dangerous very fast, that the war is a disaster for everyone involved, and that it is time for negotiations. It is time for the United States specifically to stop talking war all the time and defeating Russia and acknowledge the realities on the battlefield, as well as the political realities, and to talk with Russia. And Russia has to talk with Ukraine. And I think as this process goes on, it'll be clear exactly who the parties are that are the obstacles to these negotiations. But regardless of that, we need people to publicly go public and insist that negotiations, rather than these dangerous escalations that are going on, that this is absolutely essential. So you can go to our website, see if I can get this into the chat, and this will be the last thing I'll bother you with. There it is. So if you would be at all interested in considering joining our campaign, we'll stay in touch with you about all different kinds of things you can do. We've created some really nice short videos about the war that you can use with your friends, with other colleagues that you know. We can provide you with speakers to speak about the issue of negotiations and some of this history to the war. So please, if you could, if you're interested, please click on that link, fill in that form, and it will come to us, and we will stay in touch with you. Won't bother you too much. A lot of things going on in the world, but Ukraine is right at the top. Very dangerous situation developing there. A lot depends on what happens with the new administration. It's our time to start to impact those decisions. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Paul, for that call to action. Thank you, Cole, for helping to run this show, doing the tech work. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Let's keep at it and work for peace. I just had a new grandchild a couple months ago. Great motivation. Take care, one and all. Thank you for Professor Petro again. I lost you on the screen. Maybe he's gone already.
I think he departed. Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, thank you, everybody.